high-level general debate of the 76th session of the United Nations General Assembly continued this Monday as representatives of the nations of the world called for political solutions to conflicts and crises around the world. The third round of talks between the delegations of the Venezuelan government and opposition sectors hosted by Mexico concluded this Monday. Palestinian authorities have denounced the latest massacre committed by the Israeli regime, which killed 5 Palestinians in raids carried out in the early hours of Sunday in the West Bank and Jerusalem. From the headquarters of teleSUR English in Havana, Cuba, this is from the South. I'm Katrina Goss. The high-level general debate of the 76th session of the United Nations General Assembly continued on Monday as representatives of member states offered their annual addresses. Friday saw the high-level dialogue on energy, a collateral event that saw the participation of 100 member states and brought together heads of state and government as well as business leaders, foundations and international civil society and youth organisations to mobilise commitments and actions in terms of green energy. Heads of state and government have been addressing the General Assembly since last week, expressing their main concerns regarding the challenges ahead, especially in the wake of the COVID-19 pandemic and the ongoing struggle to combat climate change. The 76th General Debate also addresses pressing issues affecting the international community, such as vaccination rollout, preparedness ahead of future health crises, and the rising gap between rich and poor, developed and developing nations. And during his speech as part of the high-level general debate of the 76th session of the United Nations General Assembly, Syrian Foreign Minister Faisal al-Mekdad recalled the dreadful consequences of the COVID-19 pandemic.
Over the past 2 years, the world has experienced unprecedented circumstances, where hospitals reached full capacity, millions of lives were lost, economies contracted, poverty and hunger soared, cities were into lockdown, curfews were imposed, universities and schools closed their doors, and we grew afraid of approaching one another. All of this because of an invisible virus that continues to evolve and mutate, threatening to claim more lives from all over the world.
The Syrian diplomat also strongly condemned the Israeli attacks on Syria and the ongoing illegal occupation of parts of its territory.
It is totally unacceptable for the United Nations and the international community to continue to fail to enjoin on Israel to implement those resolutions and to cease its systematic and grave violations of international humanitarian and human rights laws. All the while, Israel continues to expand its settlements and support terrorists. It persecutes, discriminates against and arbitrarily detains Syrians under its occupation, and it plunders the Golan's natural resources and repeatedly violates Syria's sovereignty.
Also addressing the high-level general debate of the 76th session of the United Nations General Assembly, the Foreign Minister of Algeria, Ramtan Lamramra, defended his country's position of working in favour of peaceful and political solutions to conflicts and crises around the world.
Algeria, a pivotal country which works for peace and cooperation, is following with a great deal of interest recent developments that have been taking place in brotherly countries, and we reiterate our unchanged position in favour of peaceful and political solutions to conflicts and crises without any kind of foreign interference.
The Algerian diplomat also rejected the Israeli occupation of Palestinian territories and reiterated his country's commitment in favour of the Arab Peace Initiative.
We renew our call on the international community, and particularly the Security Council, to assume its historic and legal responsibilities and force the occupying power to put an end to its occupation of Palestinian territories and allow the Palestinian people to establish an independent state with Al-Quds al-Sharif as its capital. Algeria also reiterates its commitment in favour of the Arab Peace Initiative, aimed at establishing a solution of 2 states and to liberate all occupied Arab territories, including the Syrian Golan.
Speaking at the 76th session of the United Nations General Assembly, the Foreign Minister of Grenada, Oliver Joseph, condemned the unilateral and illegal blockade imposed by the United States against Cuba for over 60 years.
Every year, UNITA reiterates the counterproductivity of the economic, commercial, and financial embargo imposed by the United States of America against Cuba and the inhumane socio-economic hardship it places on the people of the Republic of Cuba, a country that has provided a wealth of humanitarian assistance around the world, including and during the onslaught of COVID-19, but is nevertheless hindered from participating in the global economy.
The Grenadian Foreign Minister also recalled the disastrous consequences of the pandemic on his nation.
With preliminary estimates showing that the economy contracted by 13.7% in 2020. Stark declines were recorded in several sectors, most notable tourism and air transport. Unemployment rose from a record low of 15.1% in the fourth quarter of 2019 to 28.4% in the second quarter of 2020, with 14,000 jobs being lost as a direct consequence of the pandemic. The socio-economic fallout from the pandemic has been especially severe for vulnerable groups, particularly women, youth, and the unskilled, who are overrepresented in the tourism and informal sectors.
During her speech before the United Nations General Assembly, Foreign Minister of Ivory Coast, Kandia Kamisoko Kamara, highlighted the need for equal access to vaccines to overcome the COVID-19 pandemic.
It is undeniable that at this point in the fight against the COVID-19 pandemic, vaccines offer real hope. We must, therefore, step up national initiatives and further strengthen collective action through cooperation and pooling of our resources, as well as guarantee equitable access to the various vaccines to all.
And we'll be right back after this very short break, so don't go away. Welcome back to From the South. As part of the annual addresses to the United Nations General Assembly, the Foreign Minister of Eritrea, Osman Saleh Mohammed, stated that today's global situation calls for a stronger United Nations.
Whether meeting internationally agreed development goals, combating the growing threat of climate change, or responding to the range of threats to international peace and security, the enormity of today's global changes call for a stronger United Nations that is more representative, transparent, and most importantly, effective.
Also, as part of the high-level United Nations General Debate, the Foreign Minister of Sao Tome and Principe highlighted the importance of the United Nations as an organisation that represents hope for millions of people around the world.
Indeed, our generation cannot shirk nor delay our responsibility for providing global answers that demand, frankly speaking, the adoption of mainstreamed and collective commitments. The United Nations represent hope for millions of people whose gaze turn to us at this time with the belief that we are on the verge of something new and better for the world.
The Foreign Minister also stressed that in order to overcome the economic situation in the most vulnerable countries of Africa, all countries need to embrace and commit to multilateralism and cooperation.
In light of these complex facts, combined with the new paradigm of international relations resulting from COVID-19, which continues to ravage humanity, we understand that the economic situation in the most vulnerable countries in Africa and in São Tomé and Príncipe in particular will be overcome only if multilateralism and cooperation are enhanced among all countries, from the most fortunate to the least developed.
The third round of talks between the Venezuelan government and opposition sectors hosted by Mexico concluded this Monday with several agreements reached. Meeting between September 25th and 27th in Mexico City, the parties began discussions on important points of the agreed agenda, where solutions to social, economic and political challenges were discussed. It was agreed to immediately hold several consultation sessions with various national and international political and social actors so that an efficient consultation and participation mechanism can be set up as soon as possible. The delegations expressed their rejection of the acts of xenophobia and violence against Venezuelans that recently occurred in Chile, which represent a serious violation of their rights, and also condemned the hate campaigns against Venezuelans residing in various countries. In Colombia, the humanitarian crisis worsens in the border municipality of Necoclí, where more than 20,000 asylum seekers, mostly Haitians, are waiting to cross the Panama in a bid to make it to the United States. Groups of people have been camping out on local beaches of this municipality located in the department of Antioquia, many of them for more than 2 weeks, waiting for boat tickets to continue their journey. Due to migratory agreements between Colombia and Panama, only 500 people are allowed to leave daily from this point of Necoclí, while between some 1,000 asylum seekers of different nationalities continue to arrive daily. Due to this extreme situation, the health crisis has worsened in the area, as the municipality does not have the capacity to care for those arriving. The accumulation of garbage and the absence of biosecurity measures have also made the situation worse. People have mobilised in Chile to reject acts of xenophobic violence against Venezuelan asylum seekers in the northern coastal city of Iquique. The local prosecutor has assured that protection measures will be implemented to protect the victims. The prosecutor also called on the police to carry out the necessary investigations to determine those responsible for these violent acts. In addition, means of communication were opened with the victims to identify and determine if there are more people injured, as well as to make a better appraisal of their needs. Meanwhile, the Venezuelan government announced that it will relaunch the Return to the Homeland plan to provide Venezuelan citizens with free flights with the country's flagship airline for their return to Venezuela if they so wish. And the United Nations has also expressed its concern over the violence and xenophobia against Venezuelan migrants and refugees in Chile after a far-right protest against undocumented foreigners in the north of the country saw people burn the belongings of rough-sleeping people who'd been occupying a public square for months awaiting support. In a tweet, the UN mission in Chile urged the authorities and the population to act within the framework of respect for human rights and international humanitarian rights. Meanwhile, Dr. Eduardo Stein, Joint Special Representative of the UN Refugee Agency and the International Organization for Migration for Venezuelan Refugees and Migrants, described the events in Iquique as deplorable and called on political, social and community leaders to promote coexistence and respect for diversity and the rights of all people. Brazil's far-right President Jair Bolsonaro has made it to 1,000 days in office, leading a nation facing a severe political, economic and social crisis, hard hit by the COVID-19 pandemic, rocked by corruption, and where a large part of the population faces hunger. To mark the date, Bolsonaro offered a speech marked by clear references to the October 2, 2022 elections, in which he's expected to run for a second term despite his waning popularity and early polls showing that he's far behind potential rival, former President Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva. Since Bolsonaro took office in January 2019, the former military officer has pursued a neoliberal policy of stripping the poorest sectors of resources in benefit of the rich, made repeated racist, homophobic and other offensive statements, undermined democratic institutions, attacked different branches of government, promoted deforestation of the Amazon, and overseen the worst COVID-19 outbreak in the world, with a death toll second only to the United States. And we have more stories coming up after this final short break. Stay with us. Welcome back to From the South. Forces of the occupying Israeli regime killed 5 Palestinians in raids carried out in the early hours of Sunday, September 26, in the West Bank and Jerusalem. Palestinian authorities described the move as a massacre and called on the international community to prosecute the perpetrators. We have more details in the following report with our correspondent Hisham Wanas.
Raids carried out in several towns in the northern West Bank and Jerusalem resulted in clashes and shootings that claimed the lives of 5 Palestinians. The Zionist regime in Tel Aviv claims that the operation was aimed at arresting militants of the Palestinian resistance movement, Hamas, who were allegedly planning imminent attacks against Israeli occupation troops.
que presuntamente planeaban ataques inminentes contra las tropas de la ocupación israelí.
This aggression marks the beginning of a new large-scale violent escalation that is part of a political process by which the Israeli Prime Minister Naftali Bennett wants to make clear his response to Mahmoud Abbas' speech at the United Nations and his one-year ultimatum to complete the withdrawal of Israeli troops from Palestine and the end of the occupation. One of the 5 corpses was escorted to his final resting place, while the remaining 4 were withheld by Israeli troops. The Palestinian National Authority denounced a new massacre, which it warned could lead to an escalation of the situation, especially since Hamas, in addition to promising a forceful response, called on the residents of the West Bank to rise up in support of the resistance against the new Israeli aggression. We denounce that the so-called international community is acting in a biased way in defense of the Israeli entity and against the Palestinian cause, and in this context we criticize that it remains silent in the face of this new aggression that resulted in the martyrdom of several of our Palestinian brothers. This aggression is in revenge for the recent escape of the 5 hero prisoners in an operation called the Road to Al-Quds, and we promise that our response to this crime will be swift, and this response will be strong on the part of all factions and brigades of the Palestinian resistance. Simultaneously, over 600 settlers stormed the Al-Aqsa Mosque in occupied Jerusalem under the protection of Israeli troops, provocative acts that the Palestinian authorities denounce, together with the raids, the executions which, according to UN figures, claimed the lives of 321 Palestinians from January to September the 20th, as well as arbitrary arrests, house demolitions, and the construction of new settlements, predict a serious deterioration of the situation and an unprecedented escalation of tensions in the occupied Palestinian territories.
Hisham Wannous, teleSUR, Oriente Medio.
And Palestinian Prime Minister Mohammed Shtayyeh called for international action for the protection of Palestinians in the face of Israeli oppression and killing as he presided over the weekly cabinet meeting in the West Bank town of Hebron.
Firstly, the Council of Ministers condemns Israel's assassination of 5 Palestinian youth in northern Jerusalem and Jenin, and previously in Beita and everywhere else, and calls for international action for the protection of our people in the face of the Israeli killing machine. The cabinet affirms its support of President Abu Mazen's speech last Friday before the United Nations General Assembly, in which he affirmed that Palestinians have a right to live in freedom and dignity, and that Israel's disregard of the 1967 borders brings us back to the 1947 partition of the border. The continued diminishing of the geographical base for a Palestinian state brings the conflict over Palestine to square one.
A strong earthquake struck the Greek island of Crete early on Monday, killing at least 1 person and injuring nearly a dozen others as panicked residents rushed into the streets seeking safety. The Athens Geodynamic Institute reported that the 5.8 quake struck 23 kilometres northwest of the coastal village of Arvi at a depth of 10 kilometres. Many buildings were damaged and some reduced to piles of rubble from the initial quake and strong aftershocks. Some 2,500 tents were set up to house those who could not safely return to their homes. Local media reported that safety inspections are underway, with members of Greece's disaster response unit flown in with sniffer dogs and specialised rescue equipment. In the Democratic Republic of the Congo, authorities have stated that despite recent activity at the Nyiragongo volcano, it's no longer a threat. The scientific director of the Volcano Observatory in Goma City explained that the reappearance of lava in the crater of the Nyiragongo volcano is a natural sign that will minimise earthquakes in the Goma volcanic zone. The statement seeks to assure the population surrounding the volcano that a new disaster is not looming. In May, an eruption of the volcano killed 32 people, destroyed hundreds of homes, and caused the displacement of tens of thousands of people. And we've come to the end of this news brief. Remember, you can find these and many other stories on our website at telesurenglish.net. You can also follow us on social media for all the latest news. We're on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram and Telegram. For TeleSUR English, I'm Katrina Goss, and thank you for watching.